thank you very much indeed for attending today's DEI hybrid Zoom and live seminar. My apologies for not being there with you, Jessica. So we have today, well, let's just do some of the hybrid logistics, as it were. So Jessica will speak for about 45 minutes, something like that. For those of you in the live audience, when the talk is finished, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. For those of you who are dialed in via Zoom, pop those questions into the chat function as we're going along, and then I will invite you to make those questions to Jessica when she's done. For those again of you in the live audience, no fire alarm is expected today, and therefore if one should go off, please follow Jessica out of the door and into the assembly area. For those on Zoom, please don't drop any hot tea or similar onto your lap, and watch out for any cables or anything like that around. Okay, on to the topic. So Jessica Lehman is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and, of course, a DEI fellow. She will be talking today about climate change in carbon communities, intimate interactions and global impact. So, just how is climate change or the experience of being talked about climate change, how does it resonate within those communities which are responsible for the production of fossil fuels? Jessica, it's all yours.
Thanks. Thank you very much, John. I'm going to do my best to share the screen now. I think that's the right one. All right, can you see? Does that look good?
That's perfect. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for having me today, and also for the wider experience of being a DEI fellow. I've already learned a lot and made a lot of connections that I wouldn't have otherwise made. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity. And I'm also really excited to share this work with you today. This is some ongoing work. So I work on this project with my research collaborator, Abby Kinchy, who's in Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York. And we have published out of this project already, but we're looking into taking it in different new directions. Kind of the part that I'll be talking about today has really inspired us to think about some sort of related set of questions, which I'll get to at the end of the talk. So we really welcome, feedback and ideas going forward. I have to advance the slides somehow.
Is the arrow not working?
Oh, there we go. Okay. The arrow is not working, but the mouse is working. So I'm just going to start out by setting the scene for you. In August 2018, Abby and I were in Bradford County, Pennsylvania. Oh, sorry, 2019, we were in Bradford County, Pennsylvania. In 2018, there was a series of really intense downpours that inundated the county. So quickly, these dozens of small creeks that are really ubiquitous in this rural area jumped their banks. Debris rushed down the stream channels, and it flooded roadways, and cracked foundations, and it spoiled fields of crops, and it destroyed a bunch of bridges. So at least 400 houses and 17 businesses were affected, and losses were estimated to total around $30 million US. The residents of Bradford County, especially those in the county seat of Towanda and the towns located in what locals call the valley, were accustomed to periodic flooding of the Susquehanna River, which runs through the heart of the county. But these flash floods were surprising. Not only did they come on quickly, but they also affected people who were living far from the river, many of whom had never experienced flooding before. But these floods were consistent with predictions of the effects of climate change in Pennsylvania, a higher number of more intense precipitation events leading to increased flash flooding. So when we visited the county some 8 months later, the effects of the floods were still visible on the landscape. from downed trees and flattened grass to washed out bridges, pile of debris, and houses that had been made unlivable and left to molder. And many of the people who lived there had moved elsewhere. On our second day in Bradford County, we stood with the county grants director on the main road in the small municipality of New Albany, which has a population of around 350 people. So the grants director pointed out the town library, which had floated off its foundation and onto the county highway during the flood. A young family had been displaced from the library's upstairs apartment. All around us, buildings remained abandoned. Some of them were full of flood debris, and at our backs was the remnants of a bridge that had once connected a series of houses to the main road. As we stood talking about these flood impacts, our words were drowned out by the representatives of another phenomenon that was really present in the county. Several large red and gray trucks bearing the Halliburton logo rumbled by, these kind of emissaries of the fossil fuel age that dwarfed the small town streets and momentarily made it impossible for us to continue our conversation. But for the residents of New Albany, this site was unremarkable because a natural gas boom has been occurring in this area since 2008. But for us, it was jarring to see these kind of centuries of the gas fields juxtaposed with this destruction that greenhouse gases emitted by the industry would ultimately cause. So this experience and others like it during our time in Bradford County led us to question the lived intersections of climate change and fossil fuel extraction. The literature on shale gas and oil gives us some understanding of communities like these. So we know that a growing number of communities host fossil fuel extraction and infrastructure, in a large part because of the rapid expansion of shale development over the last 10 to 20 years. This is especially true in the United States or in North America. So we call these communities, we call them carbon communities. And residents in these carbon communities experience economic and social effects as well as local environmental impacts of oil and gas booms. So this could be spills of oil or other contaminants, air pollution, conflicts over land use, and other impacts. So the influx of oil and gas workers, as I said, also has economic and social effects. And some of these are found in tensions over housing, which I'll talk about more shortly. So climate activists have drawn attention to the climate threats posed by fracking, which is how shale oil and gas is extracted in these places. But climate activism is rarely seen on the ground in these carbon communities. So that's what we know, but what we don't know is a lot, really. So we want to know, do people living in shale oil and gas boomtowns in these carbon communities make sense of their climate change experiences in ways that align with the global climate discourse? Or do they interpret climate events such as severe storms or droughts in ways that reflect their local relationship with the oil and gas industry? And can we understand these locally felt connections in order to more effectively advance climate policy and activism? So this might be around issues of energy transition, or a sort of suite of other concerns that climate policy and activism might seek to address. So we spent many months after our fieldwork in Bradford County grappling with these complex and often confusing intersections between people's lived experiences of the gas boom and lived experiences of the recent floods. So we're now working with this concept of carbon pressure to explain some of these intersections. For us, carbon pressures explains the unequal burdens of different stages of extracting, processing, and combusting carbon, and potentially of our changing relationship with these processes. So that could also be kind of elements of energy transition. And carbon pressures are likely to be felt most strongly in carbon communities, especially those with long legacies of fossil fuel extraction. So the other sort of conceptual piece of the puzzle that's helping us to make sense of these intersections is the borrowing from the influential double exposure framework put forth by O'Brien and Lutchenko. So they are looking in particular at the intersections of climate change and economic globalization, but we've been able to map this on to the case that we're studying. So they argue that intersecting processes will result in new sets of winners and losers, and that because these processes occur simultaneously, some people will become double winners or double losers based on these compounded effects. The language of winners and losers is helpful for drawing attention to those whose needs are likely to be most overlooked, the double losers who have been negatively impacted by both gas development and flooding. It also reminds us that some surprising beneficiaries might emerge. In our case, we found that gas companies, perhaps counterintuitively, appear as double winners from the compounded impacts of gas extraction and climate change. But I'll explain more about that in a moment. Yet we also follow O'Brien and Lutchenko in emphasizing that who is considered a winner or a loser varies with the context, the scale, and the perspective. So we want to be critical in our uptake of that language. So before I go on, I just want to tell you a little bit about how we collected data in this preliminary research. So in early 2019, we contacted people who had worked in positions relevant to emergency response to flooding and preparations for flood resilience, from agencies such as the County Commission, the Department of Community Planning and Mapping Services, the Department of Public Safety, the Conservation District, the Emergency Management Agency, several other organizations. We soon learned that many of these agencies and organizations work closely together, and several of our contacts suggested group interviews, which often then included additional people we hadn't previously identified, such as homeless shelter and food pantry staff. So ultimately, we conducted 6 interviews, each lasting between an hour and a half, with a total of 19 participants. The interviews focused on flood experiences, preparation, and resilience amidst the natural gas boom. As we have described, one of our interviews involved a tour of sites around the county that were badly damaged by the flash floods and still showed few signs of recovery. Interview participants spoke openly about a wide range of issues that concerned them. We learned that there have been major issues regarding cleaning the streams, removing sedimentation and logs. We want to look into that a little bit more, what people mean by that, and that farmers also face significant losses due to the floods. A lot of people spoke with frustration about the lack of adequate forecasting resources for the region. And we also really repeatedly heard about the community's distrust of the government and avoidance of government assistance or interacting with government employees. But across all the interviews, we were struck by these repeated references to struggles people were facing with respect to housing. It was clear when speaking to county development leaders and service providers that housing was the area where the combined impacts of natural gas development and flooding were most acutely felt. So our first key finding was that these carbon pressures are creating double losers. So the gas boom had caused a housing crisis, and many people were already housing insecure before the floods. Flood recovery was especially difficult for people who had not gained economic benefits from the gas boom. So let's unpack a little bit how that happened. To give you a little bit of context, assuming many of you are not familiar with Pennsylvania, Bradford is a county in Pennsylvania, just like here. It is amongst the largest counties in Pennsylvania, but it is sparsely populated with a population of around 60,000 and only 3 towns with more than 2,000 residents. The county is historically a region of family, dairy farming, and natural resource extraction, historically coal and timber. So you see that the median income, this most recent data I had, is a little bit below the national average in the US. But now Bradford County is a key site in a broader shift towards shale oil and gas production in the United States, having experienced, as I said before, a significant gas boom since 2008. So this map shows the location of natural gas wells in Pennsylvania, and you can see this really large concentration of them in Bradford County, circled in red here. So this is part of, you might have heard of the Marcellus Shale. It's part of this formation, which has been exploited for natural gas since around 2008. With the shale gas industry has come an influx of out-of-state workers, the construction of new hotels, and what people call man camps or crew camps, thousands of heavy trucks on the road, and major landscape disturbances. Economic growth was really welcome here at a time when Pennsylvania's rural communities were facing significant hardships in the wake of the economic crisis. And we can imagine how that continues today. Although direct employment by drilling companies accounts for a tiny proportion of jobs, it brings employment for truck drivers, steel workers, restaurant workers, and others. Since the beginning of the boom, these jobs have waxed and waned with drilling activity in the state. So I feel like something that's for me has been common in sites of oil and gas production that I've visited is it's actually really hard to tell what counts as a gas job or an oil job, because it kind of stretches out into all of these kind of services and other community jobs. It's commonly imagined that landowners in the Northeast United States are profiting from the exploitation of their mineral rights, because different to how it is here and in lots of other places in the world, most landowners in Bradford County own the rights to the natural gas in the shale under their property. So they're entitled to royalties from the extraction. However, these economic opportunities are limited by a number of factors. First, economic benefits such through gas royalties tend to accrue to the largest landowners. However, 69% of property owners in Bradford County have fewer than 10 acres of land. Second, even for larger landowners, widely fluctuating natural gas prices have frequently resulted in low or non-existent royalties. Issues with unpaid or underpaid royalties have been well documented, and local leaders informed us that in 2019, some drilling companies were actually sending bills to landowners claiming that gas revenues didn't exceed the expenses associated with gas production. Third, while producing wells can improve property values are also negatively impacted by proximity to gas drilling sites, especially if the homes rely on groundwater. And then finally, there's a lack of available land for building new homes, since landowners were seeking profit from mineral and surface rights and were unwilling to sell off parcels of their land. So there are especially really serious impacts economically on renters. So for renters constitute about 25% of households in the county, and for them, the situation was even more dire. People in the social service sector told us that wages were really not keeping pace with rental costs, and most people were not employed. Most people who are renting were not employed in the gas industry and could not afford the rentals that were aimed at gas workers who were on those higher salaries. Many of those who did secure higher paying jobs during the gas boom had lost them during subsequent busts. In such cases, we were told people could not keep paying the rent on the homes they had leased when they had these higher paying jobs. One person who works with low income residents said that it was, quote, virtually impossible to stay here if you're on one income, like working at the Dandy, so a local kind of corner store. And this was especially true for those who didn't qualify for low income housing or who remain on a waiting list for housing assistance. So our informants described long waiting lists for public housing services. So one of the people we interviewed said it's the gas industry made their lives harder, or it's made their lives harder, meaning the gas industry, because everything is run up cost-wise. And I think the poor just got poorer. There's a huge hole and they're not digging themselves out. So this, of course, was before the impacts of COVID kind of came in to make this even more severe. Flooding added new hardships atop the housing insecurity caused by economic upheaval. In the last decade, residents have suffered from serious river flooding and flash flooding, the kind of weather events associated with growing intensity and unpredictability of the climate crisis. So which we can think of as, compounding these carbon pressures. So although it's impossible to pin any one flood event on climate change, evidence suggests that periods of heavy rainfall that lead to flash flooding are becoming more frequent and more intense in this part of Pennsylvania, and that this trend is really likely to continue. So you can see from this graph here that a lot of these events of precipitation greater than 2 inches have occurred in the last 2 decades. In addition to flash floods resulting from these periods of intense rainfall, higher temperatures combined with heavier precipitation will likely result in increased flooding from earlier snowmelt. Both river and flash flooding are exacerbated by climate change, and this is recognized in the US at the federal level as the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. Flood maps that inform the National Flood Insurance Program have been updated at least twice in the last decade. I think there's some really interesting kind of like microgeographies here of flood zone remapping that would be really interesting to look into further. While residents have become somewhat accustomed to river flooding, especially following the 2011 floods of this nature, the flash floods of 2018 were unexpected. The one emergency manager said, "Flash flooding is totally different from river flooding because there's no warning time and people aren't prepared for it." Another respondent said, "Anyone could be the victim of a flash flood, even if you haven't seen it before." So from our research, it was evident that those who had been disadvantaged by the gas boom were double losers and were also most vulnerable to flood impacts. So low-income households found it difficult to secure affordable, good quality housing, and as the county's limited supply was exploited by gas workers, and this was true for renters or owners. These residents were also most impacted by the 2018 floods, as they were less likely to have flood insurance and more likely to already be living in poor quality housing. The unpredictable and spatially variable nature of the flash floods of 2018 compounded these issues, as people were less likely to have purchased flood insurance or made flood-proofing improvements to their homes if they hadn't experienced flooding before. While frequently touted as the best option from both within and outside of the county, federal buyouts were an imperfect solution to the problem, as there was little available housing that could be purchased with these buyout funds. Consequently, most people who did take buyouts to move out of these damaged housing, they couldn't purchase new homes in the area, but instead they went to apartments or low-income housing, although these forms of housing are often in short supply. However, we also observed that some impacts of climate change were at least partially offset by the local natural gas industry by generating sufficient county revenue to cover costs of repairing infrastructure and by providing workers to aid in flood recovery work. Some individuals had also gained wealth from royalty payments, which helped them to recover from the floods, but perhaps surprisingly, this wasn't to a great extent. So in Bradford County in 2018, the county received over $6 million in impact fees collected from gas drillers. And this increased the local tax revenues in towns where residents' property values grew. This is tax revenues in the US are tied to property values. And these were used to repair infrastructure that had been damaged by the flood. So in one instance, a low-income municipality didn't have sufficient tax funds to fix its sewer system, but the county could pay for the repairs due, the county commissioners told us, to the economic cushioning that had been created by the gas development. However, these impacts of flooding were not offset for every community within the county. So communities that had not been enriched by the gas boom had small tax bases, which resulted in fewer available resources for gas recovery. So that was the case in the town of New Albany that I mentioned at the beginning. Second, gas workers provided essential labor during the flood cleanup efforts. For instance, during the 2011 flood that submerged much of Athens Township, and in the aftermath of the 2018 flash floods, gas workers were directed to assist with the recovery effort. Multiple people we interviewed said this enabled the community to recover more quickly than other flooded communities where the gas industry was absent. They did note, however, that gas companies billed the county for the workers' hours. Their aid wasn't altruistic, although some people perceived it to be. So it's a quote from one of our interviews. They said, several companies have people go out for up to 2 weeks. They help people muck and gut and then came with trucks to haul it away. They didn't do it for publicity. There are no negative impacts. Flood will happen, so that we were kind of asking, like, are there any negative impacts of having the gas industry here when it comes to flooding? And they said there are no negative impacts. Floods will happen where they happen, unrelated to industry activity. They said a lot of times you have people who aren't asking for help, aren't going to the agencies, so they're not going to the government for help. But the gas companies have helped. So we might expect that flood events would cause people to be wary of an industry that contributes to climate change. But in each instance of helping with flood recovery, the natural gas industry built social capital within the community, further cementing the county's reliance on gas development and enhancing public perception of gas companies and workers. The tightening of ties between the gas industry and the county means that alternative paths to economic development and critiques of the gas industry's climate impacts become less likely. Thus, gas companies use the flood events to strengthen their social license to operate. So notably, we found local leaders didn't make these connections between climate effects and the industry and their recent floods, even though they understood that climate change was making floods more frequent. So social license to operate, or the capacity to meet community expectations in excess of the legal regulation, is both increasingly important and not guaranteed in the Marcellus, as in other sites of extraction worldwide. The idea of a social license to operate goes beyond corporate social responsibility because it's more about the company, than a company's image to the general public. It's about their ability to continue operations in a community without sabotage or non-compliance. So in a place where people own their mineral rights, they're kind of, in a way, they have some power over whether or not gas drilling happens there. So Anna Zalek and others have demonstrated that social license to operate is attained through heterogeneous mixes of coercion and consent through both philanthropic initiatives and security apparatuses. In Bradford County, one county official distinguished the good operators as those that have a permanent presence there. And he said, they have people whose job it is to go to the Chamber of Commerce meetings, be with the Conservation District, sponsor this event. They're going to be a big player in our Earth Day celebration this month. And I get it, they may not be altruistic in nature, but they're doing the right thing anyway, so who cares? They ingrain themselves in the community, and you can count on them. So beyond these kind of immediate effects, we also noted that only one of the people we interviewed drew causal connections between gas development and climate change. Gas development was seen as helpful for coping with flooding, not one of its indirect causes. So Goldman and colleagues have noted that conflicts over knowledge about climate are usually about a lot more, about ontological difference. So here, conflicting climate knowledges are shaped in parts by relationships with the gas industry, resulting in continued dependence and failure to make causal connections between natural gas extraction and climate impacts. Flood preparation efforts focus on response and adaptation rather than preventative efforts to slow the production of greenhouse gases. So we didn't really explicitly ask people about climate change, but it kind of came up naturally. And some of them said, there's some quotes from the interviews, they said, if you broad brush as climate change, it's not a local issue and there's nothing you can do about it. Somebody else's problem. We're all victims. Nothing we can do about it. It's too big. And so there's a whole different discussion about when it comes to saying there's something we could do about that as opposed to just preparing for it. So in this context, the natural gas industry emerges as a double winner. Despite multi-scalar environmental harms, the industry retains its hold on specific geographies, not only through the uneven distribution of benefits, such as jobs and royalties, or even through discourses of bridge fuels, but also by constructing climate change as something separate from its operations. When climate change and fossil fuel extraction are understood as producing separate but overlapping impacts, the fossil fuel industry can position itself as proactive, helpful, and even necessary to climate disaster recovery. So I wanted to spend the last few minutes here, 5 or so minutes, talking about where some of the kind of future directions for the research. Again, it's very much still under development, so I've framed these as questions that we are considering as we take the work further. We considered in different kind of geographic contexts, potentially some slight shifts in focus. So one of these key questions is, how do fossil fuel legacies impact carbon futures? So we found that in Bradford County, one of the big takeaways was that these historical and ongoing entanglements with the gas industry affected people's climate resilience in complex and really specific ways. So things around, how the housing resilience issues that I've already mentioned. And we expect that this is true, although different, in other locations and contexts. So, I think that there's a whole set of circumstances that make Bradford County unique, just as any other place would be. But this kind of relationship between histories of fossil fuel extraction and these complex carbon futures, which might involve, climate impacts, might involve ongoing extraction, might involve green energy. We want to better understand this relationship. There's really implications here, I think, for energy transition, and not just for, a lot of times I think when we think about energy transition and fossil fuel legacies, we think about how people's jobs will change, or how people who have kind of conventional energy industry jobs might be reskilled into green industries or this kind of thing. But I think that, here we're looking, it's not just about jobs, but also about a whole range of community impacts. And we also think, there might be ways that fossil fuel legacies actually positively impact people's ability to kind of adapt to these different carbon futures. For example, people who know a lot about oil and gas infrastructure might have, more sophisticated ideas of how the underground works or how energy works, or, and all of these things could, actually help them to make sense of a changing energy landscape. So then the second question is, what concepts of climate and climate change or change resonate for carbon communities? So we often assume that it's urgent, that we need urgent action to halt climate change, and to do that, we need to cultivate a kind of planetary consciousness to sort of understand the global scale of climate change. But we found that people make connections between the fossil fuel industry and climate impacts in these locally specific ways, rooted in lived experience. So people in Bradford County were making these connections between climate change and fossil fuel extraction, and we found that these communities might not adopt this language of global climate change, but their desires still might align with some of the goals of climate justice, such as ensuring safe housing for everyone. And this is a kind of theme that's come up as we've expanded this work. So we had a workshop in January, which DEI kindly sponsored, and we were talking to people who do some kind of similar work in different communities around the world. And one of the repeated themes was that even though people were really talking about issues related to change and to climate justice, we might call climate justice or things like this. They didn't really use this language, and in fact, these concepts didn't necessarily resonate in the same way. So I think thinking about, well, what would something like climate justice look like from a site of fossil fuel extraction is an important and interesting question. And then finally, I think a kind of like thing we return to as we think about the next directions for the work is also this really prominent role of the home in understanding these intersections between carbon and energy. So the home really emerged as a site where the intersections of climate change and fossil fuel extraction are being most keenly felt. And of course, the home has a lot of significance for social scientists, for feminists, economic, and environmental geographers. If you think about the home as the site of social reproduction, as a site where intimate relations play out, but also these global connections are reflected. It's a site where people are encouraged to be responsible for environmental degradation in kind of individualized personal ways. And yeah, so it's a really rich site to think with. And I think that there are plenty of people in DEI who would agree with that based on some of the other work that's being done here. So one question that I'm really interested in is what we could learn about kind of the contemporary politics of carbon and energy from looking more closely at the trajectories of homes in different carbon communities. So that's some of the ideas that we're thinking with as we take the project further. Thanks so much, and I really welcome any feedback or questions.
Thank you very much, Jessie, for as ever a very stimulating talk. There are a couple of questions. In the chat, but I wonder, are there any in the room? Does anyone have their hand up there? Jessie? No?
I do have a question, yes.
Yeah, my question is, okay, in your research, you identify the winners and losers in the community. It's possible to discuss this finding in your research from the climate justice perspective, for example, the 3 tenets of justice, the distribution, the recognition, using this theory of climate justice.
Is it possible to map that onto that, as you're asking?
Yeah, it was when you identify this
vis-a-vis the climate justice.
Very clear what is suffer with this with the benefits you show that is okay, that royalties for the city, but in the other hand, there are population that is suffer, for example, with air pollution and other consequences from the extraction of the gas.
Yeah. So the question is about like whether or not the kind of winners and losers were winners and losers in the sense of the kind of like principles of climate justice around like participation and recognition, distribution, right? Yeah. So I think we didn't quite map it on to, like, we weren't necessarily using climate justice as the framework for understanding this particular situation. I think we were kind of looking like almost like more basically at like who's benefited and who hasn't benefited in both kind of like economic senses, environmental senses, that kind of thing. So it's like, I think more of probably like a schematic sketch, or like a, what's the word? Just like a loose sketch, I guess, in terms of understanding like these different, how these different impacts have created winners and losers. But I think it would be really interesting to map on, with the understanding that that's just one way of understanding climate justice. Like, what would it look like to map that on? Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Jessie. I've got a couple of questions online. Jenny, do you want to ask yours?
I'm really sorry, but we've got some work going on here, so I hope that you can hear me. Or I can go after. There's some drilling going on. It's not for gas extraction. If you can hear me, I was interested in whether any of the extraction processes, rather than just weather events, impacted the communities, whether, you know, just shifting earth and transport had, because I think that's a concern here. And also, you know, what lessons do you think we might learn from what's gone on in Bradford County for communities where there's potential fracking or potential new coal mining in the west of England? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for those questions. Yes, I can hear you just fine. Yeah, I think they're really good questions. So, I mean, there's been a lot of documented and some actually the research that Abby's done, research about water contamination from fracking in these areas. You might have seen, like, you know, there's even some very like spectacular people who are able to light their tap water on fire because of methane, which is a bit debatable whether or not it's coming from fracking, but probably is. And also air pollution. So those are the kind of issues that I think have probably like gotten the most environmental impacts that have gotten the most attention in Pennsylvania and in the Marcellus. So one thing people often like interpreted our questions were as saying like, is fracking causing flooding? And that wasn't, you know, it was not like a direct one-to-one in this area, right? It's about climate, a more complex process, but there's also probably ways that flooding intersects with fracking. So if like tailings ponds or well pads are flooded, then chemicals can get into the groundwater, can go where they're not supposed to go. So yeah, there are some kind of physical or direct intersections as well. In terms of the lessons for what could happen here, I think to me it's kind of general lessons. I think that the differences in geology and land use, and mineral rights kind of make things quite different. Even in the US, I've also spent quite a bit of time in North Dakota, where there's a shale oil boom, but just even like the differences in the geology there make a different set of issues more prominent. But I would say that some of the things that I've seen in both places are that a lot of times like jobs are, you know, the big promise is around jobs and employment, economic progress. But I think it's just really always important to remember that that it's not like a rising tide that lifts all ships, that some people really benefit, but others really don't. And that a lot of times those benefits are temporary. And so, you know, there's boom and bust cycles. And that also, I mean, at least in the US case, a lot of times they accrue to people who are temporary workers coming in from usually other sites of oil and gas booms. And so, yeah, they don't necessarily, and, you know, these booms do a lot of times really kind of like reshape what communities look like. So, you know, it's not to say change isn't always bad, but there are those kinds of like dreams of universal economic improvement don't come to fruition in the same ways for everyone. And that, yeah, there's a lot of also, yeah, a lot of environmental impacts that can be quite tricky to monitor in a way that is legible to people who would enforce regulations.
Thanks, Jesse. We now move to Laura.
Thank you very much, Jessica. It was extremely interesting, especially to understand I think the fact that we always know, but we cannot demonstrate that climate change is particularly felt by the most vulnerable, by the very poor communities and the households, individuals. So my question is about which kind of redistributive policies were actually implemented in the aftermath of the floodings, to elevate the situation of the very poor households there. So was there any pro-poor initiatives that were initiated there? Otherwise, yes, it's very obvious from your presentation that those were the ones losing the most. And I wonder whether maybe the state or federal government would have had the responsibility to redistribute resources, tax revenues towards those poor communities, poor households. Thank you.
It's a really good question, and one I think that we have a kind of incomplete answer to at this point. So, like one thing in the U.S., most of this is controlled on a state by state basis. But one thing that we would like to look into a little bit more is actually where. So the government gets these impact fees from the natural gas industry, and they're kind of like a form of taxes. And there are some programs in the state to redistribute these impact fees, including housing programs. We didn't really see any evidence of that, like no one told us, oh, this housing is, bought through these programs. So we feel like there's a bit more work to be done there in terms of actually tracing out like where those impact fees are going and what these housing programs are being used for. There's also a lot of kind of contention around like the scale of that redistribution, because one thing you hear all the time is that the tax revenues stay in the cities, and that it's the people in the community, and that the cities are not where the gas drilling is, but it's where populations are more dense, where there's urban poverty, and that people in rural areas at least perceive that they're kind of benefiting from the impact fees, even though that's not where the impact is happening. So I think that there's like, but at the same time, it's like a state, it depends what you feel, what scale you feel your community is, I guess. But so I think that there's some scalar questions there too. In terms then there's also, so FEMA, just the federal, at the national level, the disaster has to be a certain threshold for people to qualify for individual compensation. So even FEMA might come in and do something for the community, but in order to like give individuals assistance, it has to be over a certain threshold. So the 2018 floods didn't reach that threshold, although the 2011 ones did. So that's another place where these kind of like inequalities can be felt. And then the buyouts are another area where often like low-income people are being bought out of their homes to move out of the flood zone, and this ends up being kind of the most attractive option for a lot of people because they can't afford to buy the kind of, well, you can't buy flood insurance if you're in a flood zone, and so they couldn't afford to make repairs on their homes if a flood happened. But those buyouts are also kind of rife with a number of problems and not available to everyone.
Yeah, can I ask you another very, very quick question?
One.
Yes, so this is from the government view, but do the firms, the oil firms, contribute to some social initiative within the communities? Is this sort of a corporate social responsibility? So are they also active in helping the poor communities and so on? Is that a requirement as well, perhaps, like here in the UK?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a requirement or at what scale it's a requirement. You definitely see in all of these communities will be like, this new baseball field for the high school is sponsored by this energy company, or we heard a lot about energy companies helping to clean up or sponsoring events in the community. So there's definitely like corporate social responsibility things going on.
Okay, one last question for you, Jessie from City. City, do you want to ask your question? Please?
Also another question in the room, but we'll ask. Yeah.
Oh, right. Sorry. Thank you. City first.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's about one picture that you show is the winds, the sunsets, and you need renewable energy. This is the gas. What was this the predominant narratives in the city that you?
So you're asking about like what is the kind of predominant narratives about like renewable energy I mean, when we in 2019, of course, like things might have changed since then. There was really like a kind of not much. We didn't really hear any uptake about anything about alternative energy. And I've tried to find that picture because I'd seen it. We were like going down the motorway, a couple times, so I had to do like some Google image sleuthing. There's this big billboard on the side of the road that says the sun sets, the wind dies, like we need PA natural gas, so Pennsylvania natural gas. So this is kind of like, this is the thing that will be reliable. But yeah,
quite disturbing. I thought that, Jesse, that bit of promo from the gas company. I'm going to take one last question. Sissy, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, please. Yeah. My question is, are there any controls or measurement that people or government can do based on the impact of that flooding, right? Because flooding can happen every time, so there must be like a control or measurement, any technology that prevent the impact of the flood, actually.
Yeah, so definitely like better better like stream management, I think would probably help. I think it's a bit challenging when, or at least, from what people were telling, I'm no expert on flood management, but I think it was, challenging from what people were telling us in terms of flash flooding, because it is unexpected and you don't necessarily, it's not clear necessarily where like investment of, protective measures would be helpful. But I think, people had ideas about how to improve flood resilience. A lot of them were around engineering streams. A lot of them I don't think necessarily would, were their ideas weren't necessarily reflective of like the most recent science on this, but also around things like weather forecasting, flood modeling. I think, in a lot of ways there are knowledge tools that could also help to improve the situation in the future. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to draw the proceedings to a close. And Jesse, thanks once again. As Barbara says, absolutely brilliant talk.
Yeah.
Jenny too, thoroughly enjoyed it. We look forward to hearing you again, and good luck with the ongoing research. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your questions too.